Hello, my name is Joshua and this is Bible United. Today I want to take you on a journey throughout the entirety of the biblical timeline. In order to do so, I'm going to share with you my website and forum. This is e-jw.org. That's eJehovah'sWatchman.org. And here we discuss all kinds of biblical subjects. Everything from biblical questions to skeptics, convictions, right and wrong, individual scriptures, Revelation, Daniel, forgiveness and sin. And today I want to go over a recent project that I had worked on. Oftentimes in Scripture, we'll study a subject and come up against cognitive dissonance. I've mentioned this before, that if there's a contradiction in our understanding, we tend to have an uncomfortable feeling that contradicts our current understanding in any subject, really, but specifically here discussing Scripture. And what we do, we tend to use confirmation bias in order to get rid of that uncomfortableness. So we look into the text and interpret it in a way that agrees with our current belief structure in order to comfort our own understanding, so that we have no conflict of interest and concerns, any concerns in our faith. Rather, what we should do is use those uncomfortable moments of recognizing contradictions within our current understanding, so that we may work out those incorrect wrongness understandings within our current understanding structure. And this was one of those moments where over the years I had worked on the biblical timeline, and there was always a thing here or there that wasn't quite fitting together. So we must go back and work on those contradictions. And I was able to remove all contradictions and paradoxes within my understanding of the timeline of history and Scripture. A few things I was able to prove. Adam's first year, 3966 BCE. Now what we're doing is we're concerning ourselves with the biblical timeline. Well, then not necessarily that was first man Adam's creation day or not is irrelevant. The creative days 1 through 7 with the rest day concern themselves with God's plan to remove the darkness and separate the light from darkness. The Tower of Babel narrative, Genesis 11 occurred 2209 CE. Peleg was born the same year. That was the same year as the Watchers confused the languages at the Tower of Babel, his name meaning division. Tel al-Haman was Sodom. There have been a few archaeological excavations in this location, an ancient city east of the Jordan, right in the location where Lot would have been located after the separation from his brother Abraham. Most recent excavations, 2005 to recent, lead archaeologists believe that this is the actual location of Sodom, which is believed to be destroyed by an airburst. As we move on, at the time of the sacrifice narrative of Mount Moriah, Isaac would have been 12 years old. And that's the same age, in fact, that Jesus was when he remained behind at the temple, when he, Joseph, and Mary and his family would travel to Jerusalem once a year. Josephus was right. The Hyksos were the Israelites. And Jesus' sacrifice was Passover of 31 CE. We start with the 430 years spoken of, from the promise that was ratified through Abraham to the law given to Moses just after the Exodus. Now this promise ratified through sacrifice to Abraham, and a promise to give all of the lands that God had shown him in the land of Canaan. We read at Galatians 3, verses 15 through 18. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promises void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise. Therefore God promised Abraham's seed would possess the land that he had showed him, and that was in chapter 12. However, that covenant in chapter 12, before Abraham had left Haran, was not yet ratified or sanctified through a sacrifice, and that doesn't occur until chapter 15. Therefore, Paul's indication of when the promise given to Abraham is the ratification in 15 that Paul is talking about. And it says, 15:18, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the greater river, the river Euphrates. So in fact, what Paul is indicating here is that the promise given to Abraham, that offspring is Christ, that he gives that land to. Verses 8 and 9, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So it was in that moment that covenant was ratified by God, beginning the 430 years. There are 1,656 years from Adam to the flood. There are 352 years from the flood to Abraham's birth. And then, after Abraham and Sarah left Haran in chapter 12, they went to Egypt. And then after leaving Egypt, Abraham and Lot separated in chapter 13 of Genesis, when Abraham settled in the oaks of Mamre. Then in chapter 14, Abraham rescues Lot and is blessed by Melchizedek. Then in 15, the covenant is ratified through sacrifice, and that's when Paul speaks of the 430 years from it until the law. And at this point, we know Abraham was older than 75 when he left Haran, and not yet 86 when having Ishmael. So when this promise in chapter 15, he's between 75 and 86. Now in chapter 16, Abraham's servant Hagar had Ishmael when Abraham was 86. And Isaac is promised in chapter 17 when Abraham is 99. And that's the same moment that Sodom is destroyed. Same year. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Therefore, there are 452 years from the flood until Isaac's birth. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac is weaned in chapter 21, and the sacrifice narrative comes in chapter 22, where Abraham and Isaac climb Mount Moriah in the sacrifice narrative. Now, once you know the year Abraham was born, you know the year Sodom was destroyed and Isaac age at the sacrifice narrative and so on. Once you can establish what year Abraham was born, since there were 352 years we know from the flood until his birth in the 1656 before, once we know when Abraham was born, we know the entirety of the biblical timeline. Sarah dies at 127 in chapter 23, therefore Isaac is between 3 and 5 to 37 in the sacrifice narrative. Now the 450 years. In Acts, Paul says, "The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. And for about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. All this took about 450 years. And after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet." Now, these 450 years were the time Paul speaks of the choosing of the fathers until the separation of Canaan. And the 400 years. Paul says in Acts, "And God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. But I will judge the nation that they serve, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place." In Genesis 15, "Then the Lord said to Abraham, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Abraham's offspring would sojourn in a land belonging to others. Now, there's a critical distinction between Abraham himself sojourning and his offspring sojourning specifically. Therefore, the 400 and 450 years begin at the same year, while the 450 years end 50 years after the 400 years. The 400 years, Israel leaves Egypt. They spend 40 years in the wilderness, and then 10 years after entering Canaan, Paul says the land is divided. Now the 480 years. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is in the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Now we have a set point here of the foundation construction of the temple itself being 480 years from the moment of the Exodus. Now it's accepted secularly that the construction and foundation of the temple was in 966 BCE. And we can go further to establish this linchpin in history. Japheth said there were 300 years from the last year of the Exodus to his time. Then we know the remaining judges to Samson were 57 years until Saul's reign. And then Paul said Saul reigned 40 years. And we know David reigned 40 years. And we also know the temple's foundation came in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Judges 11:26. While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years. Why did you not deliver them within that time? This is Jephthah speaking. And so at this point we can anchor to work back from the foundation of the temple to the Exodus, to Abraham and Isaac, and ultimately Adam. And there are some consequences to this understanding. If we take 480 years from 966 BCE back to 1446 and the Exodus that we get from Joseph began his rule in Egypt in 1677. That's the same decade as accepted of the Hyksos entrance into Egypt. The Semite group, known in archaeology to be, in fact, mostly women in those groups. They didn't come in and conquer. They came in and settled, just as Joseph and his family are described. And this chronology, in fact, shows that Joseph would have become governor in 1677 BCE. Jesus would have been the same age as Isaac when remaining in the temple for 3 days after Joseph and Mary left that of 12 years old. It's interesting that Joseph and Mary traveled 3 days, just as Abraham and Isaac traveled 3 days. Both Isaac and Jesus at 12 years old standing on the same exact spot where the temple would have been built in Isaac's time, and where the temple was, Jesus answering questions in the temple. This chronology means that Peleg was born in 2009 BCE, the same exact year as the fall of Babylon by God in Genesis 11. Just a few months later, Peleg is named division, just after the confusion at the tower. Sodom's destruction occurs at 1859 BCE. It's the same time that the archaeologists at Tel al-Haman believe an air burst destroyed that city in 1850s BCE, confirming the archaeology through the chronology of the Bible. This also means there are precisely 70 Jubilee cycles from the division of Canaan in 1396 BCE to 2035 CE. 3966 BCE in Adam's first year is exactly 6,000 years to 2035 CE, sixth created day. And that's the same 7-year cycle in which the holidays line up with the chronology of Daniel, only once in every 2,000 years. So feel free to head over to my forum and check that out. Feel free to copy this timeline so that you may look at it at your leisure. And I want to thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Please subscribe. And I look forward to bringing more content like this in the near future. God bless.